Welcome to the Therapist Uncut podcast, where off-the-clock therapists who happen to be friends share their uncensored thoughts about real life. Join us weekly in spreading positivity and making mental health relatable through casual conversation, inspirational stories, and real talk with friends who happen to be therapists. Please welcome your co-hosts, Nikki Young, Jolene Daly, and Alyssa Nahara.
Hey everyone, welcome to Therapist Uncut. We are back with myself, Nikki Young. We're here with Alyssa Nahara and Jolene Daly, and we are here to talk with you about real life, what's going on in the world.
I think one of the major themes that have come up in this world is this ongoing challenge with having really hard conversations, whether it's about health, controversial topics, whether it's about trauma. It's just, we're in an era where we are continuously placed with opportunities where we can have difficult conversations, but really important ones at the same time.
And I think social media and technology really exploding over the last several years has given people access to more information. So I think that these conversations have been more frequent, likely because of the access to information, which also presents its own challenges, right? Because then you have platforms for everybody to share. There's no longer, I don't think, two sides to something. There's like 65,000 different sides to something. And
everyone seems to have their own side, and they don't seem to know how to have difficult conversations. They don't really have conversations, it seems like, most of the time. Just listen to my story and listen to my story.
Yes, there's not a lot of listening going on. There's a lot of talking happening.
Yeah, it's almost like we come into a conversation and we already know what our agenda is, and our intention is just to get it out and maybe convince the other person or the other party, when that's not what the intention of a dialogue is and having a conversation is. A conversation is a two-way street, right? You don't talk to your partner, talk at your partner, and then don't give them a chance to talk back. It's a two-way street.
Well, some people do, and that's when you should come see me for couples therapy.
Very true,
just saying.
Very true, because some people do. It's a habit that we create. Absolutely. And it's a habit that we have to recognize and choose how we want to change that habit and how we want to actively listen.
I talk to people all the time about the fact that when we have conversations, for the majority of people, we have a conversation, we sit there and we listen to the other person while we're thinking already of our response. So once we start thinking of our response, we stop listening. You're not actually listening to the person. What you have to do is shut up.
Well said, Jolene.
say it again. Well, say it one more time, please.
Up. I did learn that, so I do have to give credit if the individual ever watches this episode. I did not come up with that myself. There's an individual who taught me, practice your shut-ups. Mm-hmm.
Practice your shut-ups. I like it. Okay. No, and part of that, I think, is not just shutting up our voice, but shutting up our, like you said, our brain, our preparation of our comeback. We got to shut that part up too. And actually, when we're being quiet our brain a little bit and take in the information from the other person. And that doesn't mean that by the end of the conversation, you're going to 100% agree with the person, but it means that together you can hear one another's views and have not that there's going to be not the emotions in there, but have a more peaceful, respectful conversation. And you might learn something.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to agree with everybody. I don't know about you guys. I don't want to live in a world. Oh my God, I could not imagine living in a world with a bunch of me's. I mean, let's be honest. Okay, so we're a few episodes in. You all are watching. Be honest. Do you really want to live in a world with a bunch of me's or a bunch of you's?
Probably not. Probably not. But that is the beauty of disagreeing and listening and being diverse. And these conversations that we're talking about, these are various different levels of tough conversations. And somebody once told me, a very important professor in my graduate career, actually, and he knows who he is, he would constantly tell us, you only grow when you put yourself in uncomfortable situations. We hated that, right? We're like, well, I don't want to be uncomfortable. Like, I hate not knowing what I'm doing. I hate not knowing what to expect. But truly, when you reflect back on all the growth that got you to where you are today, it's because you had incredible moments of uncomfortability, if that's a word. But it sucked for a little bit. But in the end, you and whomever is a part of this conversation or event was able to grow in a really healthy, positive way.
Definitely. And I think I had an example of this last night. So like I said, in my perspective, there aren't two sides to this current conversation, or the many current conversations going on. What's the population? And there's that many of.
And 37 million?
Okay, so there's 437 million different sides to this conversation currently, because everybody does have different views on it, even if they're very similar. And that's good. Like Jolene said, I don't want to live in a country, a world, a community where everyone thinks exactly the same, because we're going to miss out on a heck of a lot. But I think about last night where, I was sitting down having dinner with, socially distanced. We were 6 feet apart, with a friend.
Socially distanced or physically distanced, Nikki?
Oh, I did it. I so busted.
Blunder.
It is. So if you're just joining us today, in the past week, we had an episode about my own personal, and I think we shared this view that it's not about social distancing, it's about physical distancing, because the last thing we want to do during this time is socially distance from one another. If you're interested in that, go check out that episode. But correct, we ate dinner in a physically distanced manner last night. And while she and I share many similar views, we have kind of some subtle differences in how we feel like these things should be addressed, I guess, different extremes potentially. And it was the most enlightening conversation for me, because we just both came to the table like, hey, I respect you, you respect me. We both believe in treating people well, and let's talk about how you see this happening. Let's talk about how I see this happening. Hey, I learned something from you. You learned something from me. Cool. Let's make the world a better place.
I have a question, Nikki.
I have an answer.
All right.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Right.
So you said, I respect you. You respect me. So now we put ourselves in the middle of a conversation where maybe that level of respect is not so apparent or may not be there. What do you do with that? How do you handle that?
And I think that's what we're looking at right now in the world, right? Is how that's not occurring. I think that people are coming down, they're not even sitting at a table. They're having these conversations without that respect. And you're right. A lot of people don't respect the other side. I think a basic level of moral integrity is involved, but I don't know. What do you guys think when you see and hear and read these conversations where they're just filled with spite and hatred and just complete and utter lack of decency? I mean, what's your guys' reaction? Because I know I'm seeing, hearing, and reading it everywhere.
Go ahead, Jolene. I'm gonna hold my tongue real quick. I will save it. You go first.
I think the three of us are a really good example of we're not all alike. We don't necessarily have probably the same viewpoint on every single situation, although I immensely respect Nikki and Alyssa. So the way I do that is I respect the individual. I don't have to respect what they say or agree with, if you want to use that word respect, as agree with what they're saying about a certain topic. That individual I can respect. So then once you do that, then you could respect what they're saying.
So I believe in one of our previous episodes, we really talked about the power of community and connection. And that's almost where all of this begins, is building the community, because otherwise we're in a place where so many of us are just making assumptions about this person and that person based on their age, their race, their education, their sexuality, and everything else that falls under this umbrella. But when we start really building connections and community, it really allows us to build the relationships, to be in a space that we are not walking into a conversation with judgment, but we are walking into a conversation being ready to listen. Exactly what you said, Nikki. I will definitely say that it is awesome to be a part of a conversation where you feel like you're being heard, despite, and you can agree to disagree. And then it is really shitty to feel like when you're not heard, or to feel like somebody is really coming in with their own personal agenda that is diluting the original message or the original conversation or intent of a conversation. Recently, I did participate in something that was very powerful. And we stood for a message that we believed in, that I believed in. It may not be a message that everybody believes in. But as we were communicating this message, there was lots of negativity that was following us as we walked. And as we walked, you can hear the different agendas that people were really trying to promote. And they were agendas that were not in line with this event. And for me, in the group that I was with, we just chose not to engage, because this is a group of people who, and I'm trying very hard not to make judgments and not to make assumptions, but it felt like they showed up but purely to antagonize, because here we are spreading this very peaceful message. We were not attacking anyone. We were not vandalizing anything, but the messages that were coming to us were not positive. They were not sensitive to the things that we were talking about. In fact, they were the complete opposite. And it was almost as though this group of people was trying to pretend like they were casually talking about things, but saying it loud enough to make sure that we all heard, because these casual conversations during our walk were completely against the message that we were promoting. In those moments, I think my immediate answer was just don't engage, because in the way that they're verbalizing their thoughts is telling me that they're not in a place to listen. They didn't show up to listen. They showed up to promote a different agenda. And it just kind of feels like that's a lot of what's happening right now. And you're right, Nikki and Jolene, like there's so many different sides right now. So many different sides to what's going on with politics and the health pandemic and all the movements that are happening. And now we're just filled in a space where there's just so many difficult conversations that need to be had.
During the course of you sharing that, Alyssa, it brought something kind of to mind for me. Regardless of who you are, and especially if someone has a trauma history, when we are presented with something that brings out a lot of emotion in us, it can lead us to react in a more, stick with me, childish manner, right? We resort to a childlike presentation when we are highly emotional, traumatized, and triggered. So if we take it, kind of look at a parallel here, as a parent, and if we're teaching parenting skills to somebody whose child is trying to get a rise out of you, your kid is upset, they're moody, they have one thing in mind, and that is the only thing that they want.
They are throwing their fire truck at you and kicking on the floor. It's beautiful. I've got 2 little ones at home. It's a beautiful thing.
Yes. So if we think about how we're teaching parents to respond to that, we're teaching parents to respond when that child is coming at you with the tantrum, the emotional charge, and they're not willing to hear and listen and come to a mutual understanding with you. We teach ignore the behavior. Don't engage. And tell that person when you're ready, that child, when you're ready to come back to me calmly and not throw your fire truck at me, then we can talk about going swimming or whatever it is. So if we now think about our community, our culture, our world right now, we have a lot of people who are very emotionally charged. We have trauma, we have very strong opinions, and that can lead someone to communicate more childishly. And I don't use that word to insult or anything. Like all of us, it's true for everybody on the planet. We're not communicating as adult-like as we might if we're talking about what sandwich we're ordering for lunch, right? So, I mean, Alyssa, you talked about not engaging with that. If you think about how would it go engaging with your child who's throwing a fire truck, they want something and they want it now and they're just boiling. If we engage, it's just going to get more heated. It's going to get bigger, louder, and nothing's going to be accomplished. So
that child in me was like fighting to get out. I was fighting. I'm a social worker. This is what I study. This is what I research. I fight for this stuff, right? And that child in me was like, oh, but I knew that was not the place. And I knew that this conversation wasn't going to be a conversation at all. If anything, it was going to be a yelling match and a screaming match where we're just talking at each other and not having a dialogue. So it took everything in me to continue to walk and not engage and not respond. And at the end of the day, our message was said in a very peaceful and nonviolent way.
So let's talk about that. Alyssa said a few words: assume, teach. Nikki said you come in and we have conversations about ignoring or to extinguish a behavior. we have to acknowledge the fact that we're human beings. We're also therapists. So this is a level of something that we understand that maybe most people don't. I tell my clients all the time, one thing that gets me my blood boiling so much is when people talk about body language and tone, and I can tell that they're thinking this or they're thinking that. And I'm like, no, you can't. Like, I studied for 7-8 years in order to get to that point. You assume, I presume there's a difference. So you're going out and you're this social worker. At the core, this is who we are now. And you're experiencing these things and you're having a hard time holding your child in its proper spot. So imagine somebody who hasn't had this experience. They don't understand this. And this is what we have. So if we just acknowledge that, like, I don't get it. Slow down. Let me hear what you're saying, because I don't, and then say again, I don't get it. I'm sorry. Rather than assuming.
Help me understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I did that last, and you make a good point, and we've talked about this in previous episodes as well. Who we are in our professional life is just kind of ingrained. When you're a therapist, you don't it's harder to turn off the therapist in you, even though we're off the clock right now. It is harder to turn that off when you go into the rest of your life. And I don't know that we necessarily should, because a lot of what we do is just healthy communication and teaching healthy relationships. So it is so ingrained in us that some of these things just come naturally to us. And Jolene, you make an excellent point that just like, I go to an airport and it's just an airport. I go with my sister-in-law, who is and I'm going to mess up, I think is a transportation engineer. And we see an airport in two completely different ways. And she'll talk about stuff and I look at her like, I didn't see that. Like, it's just an airport that has a plane that I get on to go on vacation. It's kind of a silly example, but in the same way, I think a lot of people don't look at social interactions and difficult conversations in the same way that a therapist or a social worker or somebody trained in this might look at it. So excellent point. I think that's good to keep in mind. And is there a way for us, not just us, but as a profession, healers and helpers, is there a way to add to the conversation, but not in a detrimental way of, hey, let's teach this. Let's teach our communities how to have these tough conversations and how to hear one another and understand one another.
Absolutely. And hearing each other with an open mind, and those assumptions and those judgments. And I promise you, if you are listening to this and you're like, I don't have biases, I'm not racist, I'm not this, I don't have any assumptions about this. We all have biases, but it's about keeping all of that stuff in check, keeping those assumptions and judgments in check enough that you can open up your ears and truly listen and have that conversation. Again, these conversations aren't to have everybody agree, because Jolene was right. Like, what kind of world would this be if there was a million of just me running around? I promise you, we're all going to be forgetting stuff and just not, I'm the one that's the last one to catch a joke because I just don't get it half the time.
And you definitely don't want a bunch of Nikki squirrels running
Did you
around.
see the visual of that? Like, that's not the intent of these conversations. It's not to convince you of one way or the other, but it's to have a conversation. And these crucial conversations are exactly what we need to start considering how to have in a way that is effective.
And as a couples therapist, I'm making all kinds of analogies today. It's the squirrel.
I like those, though, because I get it. When you say it in that way, I'm like, oh, okay, I see it.
All right, so we talked about the parent-child relationship and the similarities. Let's think about a couple. Alyssa, you said we said something like we need to have these conversations. 100% agree, because if you have a couple come into your office and they've spent 10 years, 15 years, let alone, decades, not talking about something that's happening between them or not happening between them, it's a powder keg and it's not going to create mutual respect. It's not going to create emotional closeness. It's going to do the opposite. It's going to drive a wedge. It's going to create lack of understanding. So what do? We talk about these things. That's not the first thing we do, though. When I have a new couple come into my office, the first thing we do is not hash out all the issues. We focus on learning some communication skills first, so that when we do start to address those really, really difficult conversations, we've got some skills to rely on. We've got a way to do that in which we're not putting the other person down. We're not getting defensive. We're not shutting down when the other person's message hurts us. We learn communication skills first before we address these issues, and we definitely have to address them. So maybe as a society, we need to pause, not stop, not sweep things under the door, because there's so many different important conversations happening right now. But maybe we just need to pause just for a minute, and each of us kind of take a responsibility to learn some communication skills first, and then come back to the table, hopefully in a manner in which we can more effectively communicate.
I really like, as I was listening to Nikki, I like that fact that I heard, we'll give him credit, John Gottman, because he has done years of research on this. So no criticizing, no contentment, no stonewalling, and no defensiveness. That will cause any relationship to have significant problems. So you have to take pause, or I like shut up. So take pause, take some deep breaths, listen to the other person without thinking of how you're going to respond, and then say back what the person has said, because you may not have understood what they've said. You understand things based on your experiences, your perception. So you have to reflect back what they've said. So shut up, listen, and say it back.
Shut your brain up, girl.
I like that.
Sounds fair to me.
Not just your mouth.
This is the beauty that I get. You guys get to join this conversation. I'm not a couples therapist. I have no idea how to work with couples. So if you need couples therapy, you call one of these two. So I appreciate you guys' input on this. Thank you.
And if you have kids that are throwing fire trucks at you, Alyssa's your girl. Give her a call.
I do work with a lot of kids. I work with kids and adults, but yes. And plus I got those little ones at home, and yes. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you sharing time with us, and we will see you guys on the next episode of Therapist Uncut.
Be kind to one another. Listen.
Thank you for joining Therapists Uncut, a production of AMP Smart Business. To learn more about Therapists Uncut and stay up on upcoming episodes, please subscribe and follow us on social media. As a reminder, although the Therapists Uncut co-hosts are licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to substitute professional mental health counseling. If you need professional therapy, please contact your local provider or primary care provider. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Therapists Uncut.